The most common question I get is, how in the world did a humanist, a historian like myself, get so interested in AI research and AI policy? And I get it. It seems like such a weird jump, right? Especially if you've been following me online for quite a while. You're probably wondering, like, what does someone who studies the past have to do with cutting edge technology? Trust me, I've heard it all. But here's the thing. I genuinely believe that anyone can apply their expertise in new ways if they put in the work to do so. And that's what I want to talk about today. Not just how I did it, but how you can do it with whatever you're curious about. Because look, I love education. I'm a PhD candidate. I've taught at Harvard. I teach online. I love my university. But I also know that not everyone will always have access to my university. And that's exactly why you see me sharing so much content online. I want people to have access to my brain, my stream of consciousness, to these insights beyond the four walls of Harvard. And we're living in what I call an autodidact period right now. Higher education is at an impasse. AI is disrupting the aims and bonds that higher education has created. And while we're in this transition period, waiting to see how the chips will fall, I think it's crucial for people to pick up self-education. But here's the reality. I'm not telling you to not go to college or university. Do not hear what I am not saying. What I am saying is that universities won't always be able to teach you everything you want to learn, especially when it comes to AI. They're learning at the same rate that you are, right? So today I want to encourage self-education. I want to encourage lifelong learning. I want to talk about, resisting the offloading of your critical thinking skills. And I want to show you that critical thinking happens beyond the university and that you can become disgustingly educated, not in a pretentious way, but in a way that fulfills the very real human desire and need for intellectual stimulation. Welcome back to Critical Thinking in the Age of AI. I'm Shay, and let's talk about how to get disgustingly educated in anything this year. Before I give you the framework for how I did this, I need to talk about something we don't discuss enough: intellectual health. We talk about physical health all the time. We talk about mental health, thank God, more than we used to. But we don't talk about intellectual health. We don't talk about your intellectual diet. And I think that's a huge problem. Because when our brains are not put to work, and I mean like really put to work, like not just scrolling and consuming, it has detrimental impacts on our sense of meaning and purpose and value. There's a reason people read beyond universities. There's a reason people dive into subjects just because they're curious. It's for that intellectual stimulation. It's so important. I cannot emphasize that enough. And this is especially critical right now in the age of AI because we have tools that can give us instant answers to almost anything. ChatGPT can summarize books we haven't read. Claude can explain concepts we don't understand. It's never been easier to appear knowledgeable without actually doing the intellectual work. And look, I'm not anti-AI, obviously. I have met and read some impeccable research and met with researchers on AI that gives me hope that we'll solve some really thorny problems in the world right now. But I am deeply concerned about what happens when we outsource our thinking entirely, when we stop doing the hard work of actually understanding things deeply. Because here's what I've realized about AI, and I talk about this a lot. AI is an amplifier. It makes good thinking better. I'm trying to see if I can get some of my PhD friends to come and talk about their research and all of the amazing things that they're working on right now in the field of machine learning and deep learning, right? And AI can also amplify poor thinking, right? And if you're not cultivating your own capacity to think critically, to understand deeply, to make connections, then AI is just going to amplify your limitations. So when I talk about getting disgustingly educated, I'm talking about cultivating your intellectual health. Okay, I'm talking about building the kind of deep understanding that actually transforms how you think, not just what you know. Okay, so let me tell you how I actually did this. I went from just being a historian to a historian who can meaningfully engage with AI research and AI policy. The question I started with was, how do I contribute my historian's lens to AI without just being another, humanities person with opinions? Because there are a lot of people commenting on AI from the outside, and some of that is really valuable and really necessary. But I wanted to do something slightly different. I wanted to be able to engage with the actual debates happening in the field, to understand the language, to speak it fluently enough that researchers and engineers and policymakers would take my contribution seriously. So here's what I did. First, I started with textbooks. I know some people are taking their headphones off. No, hear me out. Textbooks sound so boring and so old school. I know, but listen to me. Textbooks give you structured learning, chapter by chapter, concept building on concept. You actually feel yourself progressing. And here's the thing. There's so much content on the internet, so many hot takes and debates and explainers, but textbooks ground you in what the OGs, come on, the foundational thinkers have already established. And that foundation is critical before you jump into the really thorny debates. You need to understand what people are building on before you can understand what they're arguing about. Plus, textbooks prevent you from having this like Swiss cheese understanding where you know some advanced concepts, but like missed some basics, if that makes sense. And yeah, of course, you can always skip what you don't need, but the structure itself is very, very, very valuable. And also, I sometimes have really bad screen fatigue, so I don't like looking at screens for too long, and I'm already, writing a dissertation and writing research papers. So actually reading textbooks was like a huge bonus for me, so I could take a break from all of the like screen time. Okay, second thing I did, I made learning social. This is huge. I didn't just sit in my room with books or sit in my, library with books. I talked to people. I talked to AI researchers. I talked to people building startups. I talked to engineers. I talked to policy folks, people who are doing a wide range of things in and around AI. And I asked them questions that no textbook could answer, questions about how the field actually works, what the real debates are versus what gets reported in the news, like where the gaps in understanding are, right? Because, if you're new here, I say this quite a lot. Learning is a social process. And this is a major reason why I always still encourage going to college and university. It's not just about the subject you're studying. It's about who you're studying with. You learn so much outside of the classroom by engaging rigorously with your classmates, right? Like knowledge isn't just transmitted through text. It's negotiated in conversation. You need both, okay? Next thing I did, I applied what I was learning immediately. Before I started posting publicly about AI, I actually kept like a small little notebook, just a simple document where every day I wrote updates on what I was learning, what questions I had, what new research papers I was reading. This did two things for me. First, it forced me to articulate what I was learning in my own words. And that's where I believe the real understanding actually happens, when you have to explain it to yourself or to somebody else, right? Second, it actually created a trail I could look back on to see my progression, to see where my questions evolved, to notice patterns in what confused me or excited me about a subject, like I truly believe that writing is a form of thinking. And if you're not writing about what you're learning, you're probably not learning as deeply as you think you are. Like, you need to process in real time all the information that you're taking in. Next, I used my 3-bucket reading rule. So if you've listened to this podcast before or any of my content, I advocate for reading from 3 or so buckets. That's for information and growth, pleasure, and disagreement. So for AI, that looked like technical papers, textbooks, foundational research. That was my information. That was my growth bucket. Reading for pleasure. That was usually accessible explainers, podcasts with researchers, well-written commentary on Substack or other blogs and platforms. And that really excited me about the field, especially within the realm of physics. Like I have not studied, physics in a very long time since college. So it was really great just like hearing from physicists about all the new advancements that are happening with AI. And the third bucket is disagreement. So I read a lot of critiques from all different points of view about AI. I read papers that challenged a lot of my assumptions. I even read papers that I initially disagreed with, right? So, and I think that third bucket, disagreement especially, is so crucial because you don't really understand something until you've engaged with the best arguments against it, right? Okay, so that's my specific story, but let me give you the framework, or I don't know, the methodology you can apply to learning anything. So, step one, start with your unfair advantage. What do you already know how to do that transfers to this new field that you want to learn about? For me, as a historian, I already knew how to trace lineages of ideas, understand epistemic shifts, read primary sources critically, contextualize claims within larger narratives, right? I didn't need to learn those things. I needed to figure out how to apply them to AI. So your unfair advantage is what makes your perspective unique. Okay, so like, don't try to learn something, starting from ground zero. Figure out what you're bringing to the table that nobody else has, right? Step number two, identify your intellectual gap. So essentially, what's the minimum technical knowledge you need to speak credibly in this field? Notice I said minimum. You're not trying to become an engineer or get a whole degree. You're trying to understand enough to engage meaningfully. So if you're engaging in philosophy, what are some common terms? If you're engaging in literature, what are some common terms? If you're engaging in any new field, figure out what that minimum technical knowledge is. For me, that was understanding how large language models actually process data, what alignment means technically and not just philosophically. It was about grasping the basics of mechanistic interpretability and understanding the infrastructure of AI development, right? So I didn't need to know how to code a transformer, but I needed to understand what a transformer is and why it matters, if that makes sense. So essentially, just figure out your threshold of credibility. What do you need to know to contribute, not just comment? Especially when it comes to research. Like I just finished up my first AI research paper, and oh my gosh, like the fact that I've even reached the point where I can speak the language of this field and write a whole paper is like mind blowing to me, right? Okay, so step three, build your curriculum backwards. This is key. So start with the contribution you want to make, then work backwards to what you need to know, if that makes sense. Okay, so for me, I wanted to contribute to conversations about AI governance and data provenance and intellectual property protection. So I asked, what do I need to understand to do that meaningfully? So that told me I needed to understand how data moves through AI systems, what black box actually means technically, how current AI development practices handle data, what policy mechanisms already exist, and where the gaps are. Your learning path essentially should be driven by what you want to contribute, not by just purely completionism, unless that's your goal, just learning for learning's sake. Because at the end of the day, you're not trying to know everything. You're trying to know the right things in order to move forward in what you want to do and accomplish. Step four. So step four is creating forcing functions. Let me explain that. A forcing function is something that makes you synthesize and apply what you're learning. So for me, that's honestly, this podcast, right? Every episode forces me to take what I've learned and articulate it clearly enough that you can understand it. And I know sometimes I go on a philosophical tangent. So, for some people, it might not be, 100% understanding, but, just for the most part, that is my goal. But that process, translating knowledge into communication, that's where deep learning happens for me. Your forcing functions might be writing a newsletter, teaching someone else, creating something based on what you're learning, speaking about, building a project, right? Without a forcing function, learning just stays theoretical, unless that's your goal. Like that's definitely an option. But in general, you need something that demands that you actually use what you're learning. Step 5, find your Rosetta Stones. These these are the key texts, people, or resources that bridge your world and the new field you're entering. So for me, that was people like Gary Marcus and Dorkesh Patel, like people who write accessibly about AI without like dumbing it down. Like, like people who care about explaining things clearly because they want more people to engage meaningfully, right? So find the people who are doing the translational work, and that'll like save you years or maybe just like months of like confusion. Step 6, I want you to track your progression. So like keep notes, keep a learning journal, document your questions as they evolve, because you often don't realize how much you're learning until you look back and see where you started. That's why I was like, when I submitted my first AI research paper, I'm like, oh my gosh, literally a year ago, I would have been like, what are LLMs? What is data provenance? like, you know what I mean? Like, and just tracking that progress is like really beautiful to see. And those notes become valuable in other ways. They help you notice patterns in your thinking. They show you which questions keep recurring, like which probably means they're important, by the way. They give you material to work with when you're creating content or teaching or contributing. Like, the options are endless. Okay. So here's what happens when you approach self-education this way. You don't just acquire information. I want us to think much broader about this movement, right? You are developing intellectual sovereignty. Okay? Like you become someone who can enter a new field and contribute meaningfully. Not because you have all the answers, by the way. Like, I don't want this to sound pretentious at all, but it's more so because you know how to ask better questions, right? Because you understand how the field works, because you've done the work to speak the language of the field, right? So like for me, that meant I went from being interested in AI to being someone who can read technical papers and understand the governance implications and engage with policy debates about data transparency and AI sovereignty, and, contribute historical and philosophical frameworks to technical conversations, like, and see connections that people inside the field might miss because they're too close to it. Like that's the goal. Not to become an expert in the like traditional sense, but to develop the capacity to contribute your unique perspective to important conversations. And here's the beautiful thing. You can do this for any field, whether it's climate policy, bioethics, urban planning, economics, neuroscience, philosophy, like whatever you're called to understand more deeply. The methodology I gave you is basically the same. Start with your unfair advantage, identify your intellectual gap, build backwards from your contribution, create forcing functions, find your Rosetta Stones, and track your progression. Okay, so I want to end with the bigger picture here. We don't talk enough about intellectual health. We don't talk enough about what happens to us, to our sense of meaning, our sense of purpose when we stop using our brains in challenging ways. And I'm not talking about being busy or consuming content. Once again, I'm talking about that deep engagement with ideas that makes you feel more alive, that intellectual stimulation that humans have always needed. And this is especially important as we think about AGI and the future of work. Like, if we're not cultivating our capacity to think deeply, to engage meaningfully with complex ideas, to contribute original insights, like what happens to us? Right? So when I talk about getting disgustingly educated, I'm really talking about cultivating your intellectual health. Building that kind of mind that can engage deeply, think critically, make novel connections. And you don't need permission to do this, right? You don't need a university program. Though I love universities, clearly, I just want to make sure we're all on the same page. You just need intention and method and commitment. So this year, what are you going to get disgustingly educated about? Not because you have to, not necessarily for a grade or a job, but, those are options, but because you want to become more thoughtful, more knowledgeable, more capable of contributing meaningfully to the world. That's one of the most fulfilling things that I think you can do, right? Both for yourself and for all of us. Yeah. So that's it for this episode. If you want to hear more about how I actually read academic papers outside my field, because that's like a whole skill unto itself, let me know. I'm thinking about doing a follow-up episode on that and just producing more content about how I do research and all the really fun experiments and things that I'm running as a humanist and, as someone who doesn't have that formal technical background. But in the meantime, please follow and subscribe wherever you're listening to this podcast. And I want to hear from you. Comment below and tell me what field or subject you want to create your own personal curriculum for. And what are you going to get disgustingly educated about this year? You can find me on Instagram, Threads, and most importantly, my Substack, my best-selling newsletter with thousands of people learning more about AI, the humanities, and the future of work. It's all linked in the description box below. Until next time, keep thinking critically.